Hello everyone, I'm Stephen Adams, and in this video we're going to look at a modified version of a puzzle from puzzlebaron.com called Buckner's Boardwalk. This puzzle is relatively small, but it'll be very good for us to look at as we get used to using a grid for solving problems. Let's dive in and have a look at the puzzle itself. The puzzle says, Buckner's Boardwalk held a skee-ball contest this weekend, and using only the clues below, determine each player's final score and the lane that they played in. The clues given say Terence scored 240 points fewer than Jonathan. Gretchen was in lane 3, not Brandy. Gretchen scored 460 points. Terence scored 80 points fewer than the person in lane 1. Florence is either the contestant who scored 540 points or the player in lane 6, and Jonathan wasn't in lane 4. The puzzle comes along with a grid that you can see here. Normally we might have to create these grids on our own, but since if we don't use their grid, there could potentially be an infinite number of answers that fit this puzzle, we'll use their numbers and their grid. That way we know that we'll be looking at the same solution together. At this point, you should stop the video, copy the grid onto a piece of paper, and see how far you can get at solving this puzzle. Don't worry if you don't get very far. That's why we're practicing these things together. See you in a minute. Welcome back. As we go through the clues, it's really important to keep asking ourselves the question, what does this imply? Okay? Each piece of new information, each new fact fits into the overall solution somehow, probably, but it's not going to be clear without having some thought. So for example, let's look at clue number 1. It doesn't tell us anything obvious because we don't know what Jonathan's score was. But can you see why it implies that Terence did not score 460, 540, or 620 points? The clue says that Terence scored 240 points less than Jonathan. So, in order for Terence to end up with 460, 540, or 620, we add 240 to those scores, and then Jonathan would have had to score either 700, 780, or 860 points. Looking at our grid, we know that those are not options, and so we can eliminate those as possibilities. All right, so it's important here that we're only eliminating possibilities. We're not necessarily getting straight to an answer. It's going to be a bit of a process to reason out a solution. What we're hoping to set up here is a process of elimination where we're only left with one choice, and that must be the right answer. So, for the same sort of reason, going back to our problem-solving technique of analogy, the analogy here being adding and subtracting scores. But for the same sorts of reasons, Jonathan couldn't have scored 300, 380, or 460 points. Subtracting 240 points from any of those scores doesn't give us any of the remaining valid scores. Okay, so that would be a problem. Now when we look at 620 minus 240, we get 380. That's a valid choice. 540 minus 240 gives us 300. That's also on our grid. So at least those ones are possible. So we managed to get 6 implications out of one fact that didn't even look particularly useful to start with. We're going to go ahead and fill those in on our grid. Now, clue number 2 is very direct. Gretchen is in lane 3. Well, that's obvious. And Brandy is not. That's also obvious. In fact, with Gretchen being in lane 3, we can say that nobody else was in lane 3. Because the puzzle doesn't tell us, but there's an assumption we're going to make. The assumption is that each player is in their own lane and that each player got a unique score. Now, it might turn out that that's a bad assumption to make. But so far, for this kind of puzzle, it seems like a reasonable choice to make. If it turns out to be wrong, we might have to come back and redo the whole puzzle. But by stating it, at least we know where we will have gone wrong. Okay? So, learning that Gretchen is the player who scored 460 points works in the same way as the statement that she's in lane 3. If she has those points, nobody else does. And you might be wondering if that tells us anything about Terrence and Jonathan that we were just talking about a minute ago. Well, neither one of them were allowed to have 460 points anyway. But what this does is it gives us some confidence that we're on the right track. We didn't get a contradiction. So nothing came out of this that said, whoops, there's a problem. And that's a little bit encouraging. If something had shown up that was definitely wrong, then we would know that we have to go backwards and start looking at what we've done before, because there's obviously an error. So, there is another deduction that we can make about this clue. If Gretchen scored 460 points and Gretchen is in lane 3, then we can deduce that the player in lane 3 scored 460 points. Now that seems very trivial, but you'll see that it has its own spot on the grid. We check it off and we move along. We're not sure if these little tidbits here and there are going to help us or if they're going to be important at all. But the trick is we don't know what's going to be important when we get further into this puzzle. So by keeping track of it, again, we're hoping to set up that a process of elimination, which will give us some information. Clue number 4 says Terrence scored 80 points fewer than the person in lane 1. Thinking back to how we handled clue 1 and taking that analogy idea, we can take the scores that are available for lane 1, subtract 80 points, and see if anything gets ruled out. Well, 300 minus 80 would be 220, and that's not one of our scores. So we know the person in lane 1 didn't score 300. If any of the other scores were ruled out, we would cross them out as well, but we see they all work out. Now we look at the scores we know that Terrence didn't get and see if it rules anything else out. Terrence didn't get 620, but 620 plus 80 would be 700, and that's not allowed anyway. Terrence didn't get 540, so the person in lane number 1 didn't get 620. 540 plus 80, 620. Terrence didn't get 460, so the person in lane 1 didn't get 460 plus 80 is 540. And now we get a payoff from that process of elimination that we were looking for. The only possible score left for lane number 1 is 380. We mark that off and we eliminate it for everyone else, which means when we reread the original clue, we can deduce that Terrence scored 300 points. Two more small implications to take care of. Since Terrence didn't score 380 points, we know he didn't play in lane 1. No mental gymnastics required for that one. And the other is that Jonathan, who didn't score 380 points, is also not playing in lane 1. Our updated grid looks a little bit like this. And we see that we really got a lot of information out of that clue, but we had to go hunting for all the connections. And when the puzzles get larger, that's what the hard part becomes, is managing all the implications. If we don't have a grid, we will never be able to keep track of all of these connections in our head. It's always tempting to use a tool like the web-based products that I've left for you in the reference sections, but we really need to use them properly. In the same way as our examples are problems with solutions that we should work on and then use the solutions if we get stuck, use these tools only once you get stuck. Go through the puzzles as much as you can, and if you're stuck, then use the tool and see what it tells you. Okay, let's go backwards for a minute and get some more value out of clue number 1. Since we know that Terrence scored 300 points, we can deduce 300 plus 240, Jonathan scores 540. So we can go ahead and mark that one off, and now we're making some real progress on this puzzle. Clue number 5 will help us narrow down where Florence is, but only if we look at it carefully. The clue says that the person who scored 540 points is not in lane 6, but only if you look at it carefully. Turns out we already know that Johnny scored 540 points, not Florence. Then that means that Florence is the person in lane 6. Go ahead, record that new fact, and see how many new implications you can figure out from it. The first implication that leaps off the page is there's only one person left who can be in lane 1. Brandy. So, process of elimination is paid off again. Since the player in lane 1 had 380 points, we know Brandy had 380 points. We put that on our grid and eliminate everybody else from that spot, and that means there's only one score left for Florence, 620 points. The implication we're going to tie together here is that since Florence is in lane 6 and Florence scored 620 points, the person in lane 6 scored 620 points. Again, a lot of these deductions sound very trivial, but because we have these different relationships between two things, it's important that we look at all the different connections. When we get a little further into the course, you're going to see Boolean logic, and we're going to be representing a lot of this idea of two things related to each other by some logic. If we don't look at it as two separate steps, then we'll have a hard time writing good Boolean expressions. That's okay, that's for later. Our last clue is going to eliminate Jonathan from lane 4, meaning he must be in lane 2. From all of that, we conclude Terrence was in lane 4, and at this point, everything left is just housekeeping. Jonathan scored 540 points, so the person in lane 2 scored 540 points. The only remaining square in our grid is the statement that the person in lane 4 scored 300 points, and since Terrence scored 300 points, Terrence is in lane 4. We've now come up with a complete solution that contains no contradictions. So there you have it. You've solved the entire puzzle. Brandy is in lane 1 with 380 points, Jonathan in lane 2 with 540, Gretchen in lane 3 with 460, Terrence in lane 4 with 300, and finally Florence in lane 6 with 620. We can present this information in a small association table, which makes it easy to read, and that's the end of our puzzle. Well, I hope you found it interesting. Even if the puzzle wasn't your favorite kind of puzzle, I hope that you gained something from going through it, and that the process is something that you can put to work for you. There's nothing corny about getting your brain trained to look for relationship between pieces of information and using those relationships to reason about a problem. As I said, it's going to come back up in our software development when we start trying to take variables and relate them through some kind of equations or expressions. We're going to talk more about that in a coming unit. But until next time, I'm Stephen Adams, and I hope you're having a great day. Bye for now.